Hi everybody, this is Father Warner D'Souza from Malad East and welcome to my show, Food for the Soul. This is a show where we cook and we discuss the scriptures, and today I'm going to do with you Matthew chapter 5 verse 1, 13 and 14, and I'm going to cook you something which I've just kind of created for myself. You know, as a chef or somebody in the home, you follow the policy of first in, first out. So the vegetables that come in first should be used also first. And I noticed that the cluster beans that I had were beginning to wilt. So I said, before they begin to spoil, let me use them. That's how you should cook. But since I cooked cluster beans the other day, I thought, let me do a variation. And before the lockdown, somebody gave me some prawns. These are very good sized prawns. So I'm going to cook the cluster beans with the prawns. Now, a little word of warning about prawns. When you clean them, make sure that you take off the center rib. So right here there's a center rib. Take it off completely and there's a vein. Pull off the vein, and then I use some lime and some turmeric. Now if you don't take that vein off, you are going to end up with a terrible stomachache. So make sure that you do that. The other thing that I am going to tell you today, which is very important, is not to overcook either your vegetables or to overcook your prawns. Most people keep on cooking vegetables until it becomes a slush, and that's the reason why most children hate vegetables. So keep vegetables crisp. And I'm going to now cook very quickly these prawns, and then we will break the word at the same time. I'm using a non-stick pan. I'm not a great fan of non-stick pans, but I'm going to use this today, and I'm going to turn on the heat really, because I want the prawns to sear completely on both sides, and then I'm just going to leave them aside while I go on with making the vegetable dish. I want to introduce you to some of the ingredients that we're going to use. I've got about 400 grams now of the cluster beans. Now please remember that this was about 500 grams. Once you clean it, it comes down. I've got about 20 prawns in this one. They're very large. I've got 2 tomatoes which I've chopped evenly into nice dices. I've got a capsicum, and I'm going to show you how to cut the capsicum because cutting vegetables is as important while making a dish. When it looks nice to the eyes, you want to eat it. By the way, these are vegetables that I grow in my garden, so capsicums from my garden, I can tell you a little bit more about it. I've got 1 large onion that I have chopped. I have also cut a potato into nice dices, the same dices as the tomato, and I fried them with a little bit of oil. This was shallow fry. You just need a teaspoon. Shallow fried it, you want a nice color, and there you go. I've got some fresh coriander which I'm going to use at the end, and now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the spices that I'm using. So here you go. I have 3 green chilies. This red chili that I have seems to be super spicy, so I've used just about half a teaspoon, but normally if you don't have a very spicy red chili, you can go up a little bit more. 1/4 teaspoon of turmeric powder, 1 teaspoon of cumin or jeera powder, and then about 1.5 teaspoon of coriander powder. I also have about 7 cloves of garlic and about half an inch of ginger, and then a whole handful, not a handful, but half a handful of curry leaves. Interestingly, in some dishes, and I've seen this work very well, curry leaves go in last and they're really good. So I've got my pan, it's now heating up. But while that heats up a bit, and I'm deliberately keeping it on low heat so that I talk to you about some cutting techniques. A very simple thing with capsicum, how do you get even size dices? Just cut it off at the end here, cut it off here, and mind you, I'm going to use all of this too. Don't waste any of it. And then very simply slit it down to the center, and then work your knife just to break these little peels off here. There you go. Now these seeds, I simply dry them, and I put these seeds into the earth once they're dried, and boom, I've got lots of little saplings which I use. So as you can see now, I've just opened it out, and if you want to trim it, You can trim this a bit, there's really no need. It adds to the flavor. And then I'm just going to cut it down so I can place them one over the other. I could do that. Now you can press it down and julienne it very nicely so you get thin slices. I don't want to do that. What I want is little dices. And since this is not very even, the capsicum, there you go. And it just makes your life so much easier, especially if you're making a food that requires capsicum to be thinly sliced. It just works well. Everything is of the same size. So my pan right now is super hot. I can feel it there. Just going to put this in. So I even have this in my garden growing along with a lot of other vegetables. So here you are. And you always want to kind of check your pan. Make sure I put it on low heat. I'm going to put some oil in it. And what I really want to do is just sear the prawns. So while we do that, and while that gets ready, I want to take you to the Gospel of Matthew. And there's a reason why I'm taking this text, because Jesus talks about us being the salt of the earth and the light of the world. One of the ingredients I'm going to use is salt. Chapter 5 is part of chapter 5, 6 and 7, which together forms the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' first discourse. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus teaches a lot. It's called the teaching gospel. Luke is the feeling gospel. It's very passionate, very emotional. Mark is the doing gospel. Jesus is always working miracles, especially fighting against Satan. And Matthew is the teaching gospel. So 5, 6 and 7, Sermon on the Mount. Here we go. Jesus is teaching. And it begins where Jesus says, the crowds, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain and he sat down. His disciples came to it. And straight away, we know that we have identity, because we are not just about anybody. Jesus says, calls us his disciples. We get identity. Hold on to that thought while I'm very quickly just going to allow these prawns, and it's going to sizzle a bit because it's got lime juice in this and a bit of turmeric. There you go. Now, as I said, you don't want to overcook your prawns, so just let it get a little bit of searing. And I can actually smell them now. And keep it on high heat. So as I said, Jesus says to us, we are his disciples. Not just anybody. He gives us his identity. And while that's happening, I'm just going to take another line. He sat down, his disciples came to him, and he began to speak to them and he taught them. And then we have the Beatitudes, which is really how a Christian should behave. So Jesus gives us identity and Jesus gives us behavior. Look, I'm just going to leave this as it is. And many of you might think, oh dear, that's not cooked. Believe me, you don't want to overcook it because of what I'm going to do next. So I'm just going to leave this on the side with all its juices. And I am going to now start cooking the vegetable. And I'm using my very famous earthenware pots. I'm going to turn on the heat again. And I'm going to let that get hot a bit while I continue teaching you a little bit about the scriptures. So as I said to you, his disciples come to him. We get an identity. Here's what I keep saying to everybody. I'm Father Warner D'Souza, not the parish priest of St. Jude's, but really we should be saying, I'm Father Warner D'Souza, a disciple of Jesus. We get identity. And then Jesus gives us behavior. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who are meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. We get behavior. But I'm going to jump from identity, behavior to what I call prescription, verse 13 and 14, where Jesus says to us, you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world. Two examples that help us take identity and behavior to its next logical conclusion. You are the salt of the earth. Why did Jesus ever use an example such as salt? So I'm going to hold on to that thought because I'm going to get back to you. I can actually see the smoke rising from this. I'm going to put a little oil as I do, and I'm going to let that heat up a bit. Okay, so once earthenware pots heat up, they have the power to retain heat. And so if you're cooking in earthenware pots, especially towards the end of the cooking, you need to end it a little earlier than you would with any other regular pot. So I'm going to let that just heat up a wee bit. And I am going to now put a couple of these ingredients inside. Just a whole clutch of curry leaves. As I said, you can even put curry leaves at the end of the dish and it tastes really good. So just a clutch of them and it's going to splutter. I'm going to add the 3 chilies that I minced. I'm going to let that stir a bit. Now, careful with things like curry leaves, especially if you wash them and then dump them in, they are going to splutter and you're going to get always oil around you. So there you go. I'm going to now add the ginger and the garlic. And I'm going to give that a good stir. You just want the garlic to lose that very raw taste, and that's the reason why you actually drop it into hot oil. Also remember, oil releases a lot of flavors. You can really smell the chili when it goes in. I'm now going to add to this the onions, and I don't need like a meat dish. If I was cooking meat, I would want the onions to brown completely, but not in this case. I just want the onions to become a bit translucent. So I'm just going to stir that all in. Now I tend not to use a lot of oil in my food. If you do, you're going to get a lovely taste, but go easy, it's not always good for you. And it's just a bit translucent. I'm going to let that become translucent. And then 2 tomatoes go in. And you can see that's quite a large quantity. I think this dish of about 400 grams of cluster beans, which we call Gawar, and all of this can feed comfortably 6 people, a very large meal. So here you go. I'm just going to allow that to cook a bit. Coming back to Jesus and calling us the salt of the earth, I said, what a strange thing to be called the salt of the earth. But salt at the time of Jesus was a very precious commodity. The Romans were given their salary, the Roman soldiers were given their salary in the form of salt. The word salary itself, sal, means salt. Also, salt was used for cooking, and in those days you didn't have refrigerators. How did you preserve your food? You salted it. Even meat in some parts of India and abroad are salted. Ham, for example, bacon is all salted. So Jesus uses a term from everyday living so people could understand, and that's how homilies need to be preached, using categories that everybody understood. Today, of course, things have changed, lots has been lost in translation. So Jesus calls us the salt of the earth, and the whole point is, what does salt do? You see, when you eat a nice chicken curry, you don't say, oh, this chicken curry, the salt in the chicken curry is excellent. No, you just say the chicken curry is excellent. The salt has simply dissolved in it. That's what Jesus wants of us, to become people who simply dissolve in society without drawing attention. So I'm going to come to the light of the earth, but here you go, and you can see it's got this nice translucent color. It is cooked a bit and it's quite colorful. And what am I going to do now? I'm going to add all my dry masalas. So here you go. Chili powder, haldi or turmeric, jeera, 1 teaspoon, 1.5 teaspoon of coriander powder. I'm going to give this a quick stir, and as I always say, careful at this point of time. You can notice there isn't much oil. Careful at this point of time, because these masalas, dry masalas, tend to burn very quickly. And so I'm going to add the star of our dish, salt. And what does salt really do at this point of time? It brings down the temperature a bit. But I don't want this to burn, and so I'm going to add a little water. So just a wee bit of water, because I don't want it to burn. And there you go. I'm going to add just a little more water. Because I want the rawness of the dry spices to just cook out nicely. And while I do this, I'm going to take the last verse, that is verse 14, where Jesus says to us, "You are the light of the world." Remember, Jesus lived at a time where we didn't have electricity the way we do. And people really lit one lamp and they would put it high up somewhere so that the light simply diffused. Jesus is giving us a prescription when he says, "You are the salt of the earth and the light of the world." He's telling us, as he said in verse 1, this is your identity, you are my disciples. Then he gave us behavior and he said, here are the Beatitudes. And now he says, just in case you haven't understood, I'm giving you 2 examples from everyday life. I want you to be like salt. I want you to be like light. What's the whole point that Jesus is saying? He's saying, can you give to others? Can you dissolve into society? Can you bring joy to others? You know, Christianity is not a religion of boredom. There are some people who think that Christianity is a killjoy. I think it's been preached wrongly because most people interpret the scriptures wrongly. It's not a religion where everything is taken away. It's so much is given to you. And that's what Jesus really wants us to do. I'm now going to add the 400 grams of cluster beans. And look, there are some recipes that you will see where they cook the cluster beans just by themselves in a pressure cooker for 1 whistle. Believe me, by the time you are done with that 1 whistle, it just becomes pulp. Now that recipe is really good if you are making a gravy with cluster beans. And you can make a very nice gravy with by taking some curd and adding besan to it, mixing the 2 together, and then making a very similar masala and adding the curd mixture to a similar masala and then adding the cluster beans. It's quite a nice dish, but I wouldn't recommend. I like to see my vegetables retain its original color. The more you cook it, the worse it gets. So here's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to cover this, and I'm just going to let that be for a while. Let me tell you a little bit more about myself for those of you who don't know. I am a chef by profession. I went to catering college and I was taught by some really great people who changed and transformed my life. But during that point of time, I was very involved in the church, and that's why I always tell people, get involved in some activity of the church. I was in the choir. I remember while I was in the Oberoi Hotel, I used to always take the night shift because the guy who did the night shift could get Saturday off, and I wasn't taking Saturday off because I wanted to dance. I was taking Saturday off because I loved to sing in the choir, and I used to go to choir practice. So the closer you stay to God, to church, your vocation is nurtured. So that's how I moved from baking bread for people to breaking bread for people. Now I'm going to just take you back to the cluster beans, and as you can see, this is going to require cooking for a good 5 minutes, and so I'm going to meet you after 5 minutes when this has been cooked. So 5 minutes are up, and I want to show you what it looks like. There you go, come. Now you can have a good look at it, and you can see it still retains that lovely green color, and you've got the red tomatoes which give it, so see how appetizing. And now I'm going to add the prawns, and I'm adding the juice of the prawns too, and I'm not going to waste any of this. I'm going to scrape the bottom. All the wonderful juices are in this, and I'm going to give that a wee bit of a stir. And this addition of the prawns will just take the dish to another level. Here's what I'm also going to do. Add my potatoes, and at this stage I'm going to add the capsicum. Remember, you want your vegetables to taste crisp. You want color, so some part will tend to get soft like the vegetables, the potatoes remain crisp, and then you get the flavor of the prawns coming through. And you might say, Father, but you undercooked the prawns. I haven't. Now watch, because I'm just going to leave this to marry together for about just a minute. And then, because I'm cooking in this earthenware pot, the heat of this is going to continue cooking all the vegetables and the fish, the prawns together. So here we go, just a minute. Also, if you like these, what we're doing, I have an interesting blog called pottypadre.com. You'll find faith, food, travel. I've been blogging now for the last 4 years. And also you can go to my YouTube channel called Warner D'Souza, where I celebrate daily Mass live, especially during the lockdown. And of course I do some cooking, and I share scripture texts. Right now I'm doing the Acts of the Apostles with those who would like to learn scripture. It's a great time, the lockdown, positively looking at it, a great time for us to learn the scriptures. And now I'm done with this dish. I'm going to turn that off. I've got some fresh coriander. I'm going to use about 3/4 of that. And I'm going to invite you now to come and have a look at what this is before I just plate it. There you go. It's now a riot of colors. So I'm just going to put some of it in the bowl. Prawns, potatoes, cluster beans, onions, tomatoes. It's a large one pot dish. There you go. I'm going to just top it up with a couple of more prawns and potatoes. And here it is. Bon appetit. Enjoy yourself.